Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for a virtual event with Erich Schwartzel in conversation with Maer Roshan, discussing Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. For regular updates on our upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter. This evening's virtual event will end with a Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, consider supporting our bookstore and the author's work by purchasing a copy of today's featured book, Red Carpet. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. Now, a few words about our featured guest. Maer Roshan is an American writer, editor, and entrepreneur, currently serving as editor-in-chief of Los Angeles Magazine. Previously, he was deputy editor of New York Magazine, editorial director of Talk, and senior editor of Interview. He has written for the New York Times, the Miami Herald, the New Republic, the Advocate, Details, and Harper's Bazaar. He has also launched and edited a series of prominent magazines and websites, including 429.com, thefix.com, NYQ, Punch, Radar Magazine, and RadarOnline.com. Erich Schwartzel's first book, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy, was published yesterday, February 8th, by Penguin Press. In a recent interview, the New York Times Book Review said the book was fascinating. It will educate you. Schwartzel has covered the film industry for the Wall Street Journal since 2013. He reported Red Carpet over several years, logging hundreds of interviews across 3 continents. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Erich and Maer. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Good evening. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I've done a bunch of author interviews through my career, and this one is particularly exciting because I don't often have the opportunity to be with an author and a book since its inception, as I did with this one. I know Erich for a while now and heard about this book as it was kind of bubbling up, and there's something just remarkable about seeing from where it started and seeing it like splashed across the cover of the New York Times Book Review, and suddenly it's everywhere and one of the most important books of the year. And so that's always exciting. Really grateful for you to ask me to do this tonight.
Absolutely. Mayor, I have to just jump in here and say that you are responsible for a very important part of this book. You are responsible for the subtitle, because I don't think you remember this, but whenever I was talking to you about the idea, before I'd even sold it to a publisher, I had a different subtitle on it. And you just off the top of your head said casually, you need something stronger like cultural supremacy. And I thought, this is why you run magazines, right? Because you just immediately had it, and it's been the subtitle ever since then.
Well, you write like the great intellectual smart articles, and I come up with like a provocative subtitle. So that's like a writer difference there. So, the book is probably a lot of people know by now is about how China's uses economic might to force Hollywood to make lots of big compromises and to also like pave its own way into kind of dominating the culture with its own film industry. And that's been a real, apparently like news to a lot of people before you wrote this. And it's interesting because in your book, you talk about how this is going on for a while. I guess we should start by telling people, how did you get into this topic? I know you were at the Wall Street Journal starting 2013, and you had talked about how you just started noticing China was involved in everything. So tell us a little bit about that. What kind of things was China involved in even back then?
It started as a series of small stories. You would see a Chinese actress cast in a bit role in some blockbuster. Oftentimes you'd show up and she would be in one scene and not even have any lines, but nonetheless, she was there. There was a flood of Chinese financing coming in and financing some of the productions. either in the budgets or backing the companies themselves. And I think at first in Hollywood, there was a sense that this might just be another round of dumb money. This was China's chance to lose its shirt in Hollywood, as other countries and, wealthy people have done since the movie started. But then it became clear that there was actually a political motivation as well, and that this was not just dumb money, but this was actually something that the Chinese government was prioritizing. And so you started to see that even as China became more and more aggressive on the world stage in terms of whether it was infrastructure or aid or military might, there was also this soft power complement that it was trying to use Hollywood to learn how to do. And so I started to realize that the movies were becoming this kind of proxy battleground for the broader US-China rivalry.
We said it became clear. It became clear to you, or was it by then becoming clear to Hollywood as well? Because it didn't get a lot of coverage in the media, for sure.
No, it didn't, because I think tensions between the two countries really weren't that high. And so there were stories about movies being changed and censored for Chinese authorities. But at the time, the Chinese box office was big and growing, but not as big as it is today. And like I said, there was a sense, especially back in 2013, 2014, that China might be on the road to reform. So I think a lot of people in Hollywood interpreted it as just another market. And even still today, a lot of executives will tell me, well, we edit and censor movies for every country. We edit and censor movies for airplanes. Why is this any different? Well, it's different for two reasons. One of which is China's operating on a scale that no other country is operating on. And second, we aren't in an ideological battle with other countries the way we are with China right now. So the censorship takes on an additional charge when you keep that in mind.
So I was surprised to know that, like, before 1994, there weren't any Hollywood movies let into China. And at that point, you said there were just 10 of them, right? But what made China start accepting Hollywood movies in the first place? Because after the Mao times, for a long time, it was really opposed to any Western cultural imperialism or pollution, as they called it, from reaching there.
Right, exactly. I mean, before 1994, only occasionally would a Hollywood movie get in. At one point, they let Superman, the Christopher Reeve Superman, in, but then it was kicked out of theaters because authorities said that Superman was a narcotic that the capital classes use to, forget their troubles and the troubles with their system. So Hollywood didn't really have a great reputation in China.
For Reeve fans either, I read.
Not quite. So in 1994, Hollywood really, frankly, just followed a lot of other industries into China. This is in the years before China would join the WTO and start to work its way into other countries' economies. So Hollywood went in not long after Boeing did. Now, the interesting dynamic, though, was that even though they had all of these people, China was still dramatically underscreened. There were not a lot of movie theaters. And so studios went in, but really the only reason they were there was not to make money, but to try to wean Chinese people off of piracy, because they knew they were losing a lot of money because of pirated tapes and DVDs that were available for sale. So they thought, well, maybe if we can introduce a culture of movie going, that will cause the piracy to wane, not necessarily thinking that this would be a source of revenue on its own. And so the first movie that was let in 1994 was The Fugitive with Harrison Ford. And I think it made $3 million, which was like a record. I mean, that was an insane amount of money for the Chinese market. But like I said, it wasn't for another 10 years or so that it looked like the Chinese box office was going to be worth paying attention to on its own.
And I thought it was interesting that there were like cultural reasons for China to want Hollywood movies in the beginning, which were, you talked about how China had moved its population towards urban areas and they needed entertainment, and they didn't have entertainment. Was there a Chinese film industry before that like of any magnitude, or not really?
There was, but it was rather medicinal. So I think before that, whenever Mao came to power, he would give these speeches where he would say, there is no such thing as art for art's sake. art must serve the state. So you can imagine how good the movies that kind of system produces would be, right? It was a lot of propaganda films, a lot of movies about the glories of Mao, the glories of this new China, and a lot of documentaries too. There was not necessarily a commercial business. But then starting in the 80s, you had the largest internal migration in human history, with Chinese people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions moving from the farm to the city. And when they would arrive in that city, they would need grocery stores, shopping malls, and movie theaters. So that's what really spurred the growth in movie theaters that then allowed Hollywood to move in. And then Hollywood essentially became this really amazing economic tool for those new theaters, because the Hollywood movies got people to show up and then supported the development of that real estate.
So from 1994, when they let in 10 movies, to 2022, where they let in only 34 movies, right? Is that the new number?
Right.
So clearly, hundreds of producers are throwing movies at the Chinese in the hopes that they will let them in. Why don't you tell us a little about how those movies are chosen by China and who does the choosing?
Right. So the main thing you have to understand is that in order to access these Chinese movie theaters and sell tickets in China, every movie has to be approved by Chinese censors. And the censors are a group of people who, I mean, it's usually a mix of bureaucrats who have kind of worked their way through the system. I think it's seen as kind of one of the cushier jobs for obvious reasons.
Golden Globes Committee.
Exactly. Yeah, not quite the Golden Globes, not quite the Golden Globes of China, but they do get to see a lot of stuff that no one else does. And so it's a bunch of state bureaucrats. Even film studies professors have been known to sit in and try to examine the films for sort of deeper undercurrents that might prove problematic. And then if a movie is approved by the censors, it can show in China. Now, most of the time, the movies that are going into China are the big blockbusters, the big Marvel movies, the Jurassic Worlds of Hollywood. Those are the kind of titles that typically get sent to China. And so these are usually PG-13, PG type films that aren't going to wade into waters that trouble the authorities too greatly. But also, I think over time, we've had some really high profile examples of movies having to be changed in order to show in China. And those have become lessons that every studio absorbs. Because whenever a movie is accepted or rejected by China, it's not like you get a memo from Beijing saying, oh, we didn't accept your movie and here's why. So you have to kind of look at what has been accepted and what hasn't and try and divine any patterns about why a movie might not get in, and then change your own script accordingly.
Which gives them kind of more power, right, than if they had actually told them what was wrong, because then you're self-censoring.
Exactly, and then it lowers the bar of risk that anyone's able to clear.
To give the audience kind of a clue to why Hollywood studios are willing to jump through all these hoops, you had talked about how like a typical movie, or I guess a hit movie in China earns like 700 million off the bat. So
Yeah.
what does a typical movie in America now earn?
Well, so let's take, for example, like one of these Marvel superhero movies that might in the US make 300 or 400 million. It's not uncommon for that same movie to make 200 or 300 in China. But there's a key difference, and that is that oftentimes whenever it's released in China, it's almost pure profit because there are far lower marketing expenses associated with it. And there's not much that a studio has to do other than send a copy to these censors and get it approved. And so over time, these movies have gotten more and more important to the studios because basically, if you're running a studio these days, the main thing you have to think about are these major tentpole releases that lift up your entire balance sheet. And so these movies are being greenlit at numbers like $200 and $250 million budgets. And when you're already investing that much money, you all but need a Chinese release to turn a profit. Oftentimes, the difference between profit and loss, even on these movies that are making $1 billion worldwide, is release in China. So you quickly figure out that when you're reading a script that's going to cost $200 million to make, you examine it for anything that might be a problem getting it into China, and you scrub it from the script before any scene is shot.
And it's happening at a time when American audiences are dwindling and Chinese audiences are only growing. So it even as a future move. So how did China press its leverage in the beginning? I read that one of the early kind of flares about this relationship changing was Kundun.
Right.
Tell everyone about that. And
so this was a movie. It came out in 1997. It was directed by Martin Scorsese and released by Disney. And it was a movie about a young Dalai Lama and his exile from China to Tibet. And so it has a couple tripwires. It's about someone who is all but a state enemy of China. And it also portrays Mao as this evil figure and really kind of presents an unvarnished look at history that China would rather not see on screen. Now, this movie's being made in 1997, though, when no one in Hollywood is thinking about the Chinese box office. Disney, though, is already thinking about things like a theme park in China and getting the Disney Channel onto TV airwaves. So they have all these ambitious plans for China down the road. They know that it's not quite ready for this kind of thing, but they can see its middle class growing. And very importantly, they can see a world where, because of the one-child policy, there are a lot of kids in China who are only children. So if you're running Disney, this is like a gold mine. You have like a billion sets of families with only children. Like, this is like a dream for Disney. But then on the very first day that Kundun starts filming, a phone call is made from the Chinese embassy in DC to an executive in Burbank saying, you have just started filming a movie about the young Dalai Lama that is going to be a problem. And it's not going to be a problem because we're not going to show that movie in China. That was never on the table to begin with. It's going to be a problem for all of the other billions of dollars you're planning to invest in this country. And this executive, who I opened the book with, his name's Peter Murphy, he had actually, it turns out, Henry Kissinger on retainer for such things. So he and Henry Kissinger had to fly to DC and meet with Chinese authorities and explain to them the tricky balancing act that they would have to strike, because they knew that if they canceled this film, that they would be tarred in Hollywood as, squelching free expression and silencing the likes of Martin Scorsese. But they also knew that if the movie came out and made a big fuss, that it threatened all of these other plans they had for China. So they decided to find a middle way, which was to release the film but bury it. And so they released Kundun on Christmas Day on 4 screens. And then when it didn't do well, they used that lousy performance to justify not expanding it further. Nonetheless, it still got Disney banned in the market. And Michael Eisner, who was then the CEO, had to fly over and meet with officials. And there's a transcript of his meeting with a Chinese official that is just truly remarkable, because he says, the bad news is that the movie was made. The good news is that nobody saw it. And he apologizes for making this movie. And that allows Disney to get back into China and then eventually build its theme park and invest billions of dollars in the market. But it was all threatened by this movie that was made by a subdivision of a subdivision of a subdivision.
So it was Michael Eisner's diplomacy, not Henry Kissinger's vaunted diplomacy, that got Disney back on track there.
Exactly.
Did anyone in those early days take that as a signal that things were about to get dangerous, or did things go on as before? And how was that allowed? Why was there no alarm sounded then?
Well, I think because the market was still so small. As the market grew bigger, these examples took on more and more of an almost educational quality. And there's a dialectic in Chinese that translates roughly to kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And it means that when possible, to make a public example out of something, because it then teaches everyone a lesson. And so there have been a couple cases where a movie will anger Chinese authorities and cause a big political stink that then, tells every studio in town, be cautious about this kind of thing. This is why when an actor or actress gets in political hot water in China, they have to quickly apologize and make amends. There was this example last year with John Cena, who gave an interview when he was promoting a Fast and Furious movie in which he implied that Taiwan was its own country. And this goes against Beijing thoughts on Taiwan. And he had to essentially immediately film what appears to be a hostage video apologizing in Mandarin for his slip up. And the other thing that I learned is that when actors and actresses go to China, they are often sent with binders with notes on when they're giving interviews, what topics they can talk about, what topics to avoid, and if certain topics come up, how to answer those questions, because they've seen that even just a slip up like that can mean that, you know, John Cena's next 6 movies don't get released in China.
There was another example that you gave of that. LeBron James, and just how, like, indirectly even statements by, you know, even people not directly involved in the film can alter that relationship. You want to talk about the NBA example?
Yeah, the NBA example was fascinating because it was a case where I think Hollywood emerged as kind of the early student to a dynamic that a lot of companies and entities are starting to learn. And with the NBA, it came a couple years ago when a general manager for an NBA team tweeted support for demonstrators in Hong Kong. And it seemed like a rather innocuous tweet, but whenever it caught the attention of Chinese authorities, it got the NBA games banned in China and essentially jeopardized the league's entire business. And the league, much like Hollywood, had spent years investing in the market and trying to build and cultivate a fan base there. And all of that was jeopardized by this one GM's tweet. And it's only still relatively recently that we're seeing the NBA kind of make inroads back into China. I mean, it really took quite a long time, but it was another example of this comment that I think also people rightfully point out sometimes that China can often suffer from the Streisand effect. You know, I think more people ended up hearing about this comment or this tweet because of China's response than they ever would have. Than they ever would have. But I think sometimes that aggression and that asymmetrical response is the point, because it shows everyone where the line is when it comes to what Beijing will consider acceptable discourse.
So to give people an idea of how important this is to Hollywood and to what lengths they will go to, the Red Dawn example to me was just like the most amazing example of this. So why don't you tell the audience about that?
Yeah, so there was a reboot of Red Dawn. You know, since we reboot everything now. In 2009, MGM thought that they should reboot Red Dawn, which was released in the 1980s. It's a very plausible story about a group of teenagers who have to defend their hometown against invading Soviets. Sort of the ultimate example of a kind of a Cold War cinema. And they wanted to reboot this, and they knew that, you know, Russia doesn't make any sense as the villain, but China kind of did, because there was a sense that China's military was modernizing. There was already some public polling that showed that there was some American anxiety around China's rise. And so it felt like, you know, in terms of, you know, B-movie logic, it felt like the right choice. And so MGM shot a remake of Red Dawn starring Liam Hemsworth and featuring a Chinese invasion of the US. And it was being prepared for release when Chinese state media got wind of it and started publishing editorials about the tempers that would flare if this movie were released and this portrayal of China was shown on screen. And I think it's important to remember that this was, again, not a movie being made for release in the Chinese market. It was just a movie being made. And China didn't want any movie that cast it in that role being made anywhere. So it wasn't about the Chinese people seeing it. It was about anyone seeing it.
That's the part that missed, I think, a lot, right? That they're not just trying to censor movies in China. They're trying to censor movies that Americans and the world sees.
Yes, because I think they rightfully understand the cultural power that that Hollywood has, and so if you can influence those films, you influence your image everywhere. So MGM was really in a bind because they knew if they released this movie, it could be a real problem. And so they did something extraordinary. They hired a visual effects firm in Burbank to go in and frame by frame change the flags, the dialogue, any insignia from Chinese to North Korean. And they released the film as the story of a North Korean invasion and not a Chinese one. And I have to say, a little behind the scenes of the reporting of this book, I became obsessed with finding out who were the poor visual effects workers who had to go in and scrub this movie of every Chinese flag. And it took a long time because the firm was not credited. So I had to do quite a bit of digging to figure out who was this firm. And it actually was a company that's no longer in business, but they specialize in what they call hidden effects. So they're the ones who you hire if like an actress has a nude scene, but you don't want to see her underwear line. They're the ones who go in and kind of airbrush it out. And so I got so fascinated by this because these workers, you know, they work on I drove over to where their office was in Burbank. It's on the most anonymous street possible. A lot of these people had just recently moved to LA. One of them was a former limo driver. And here they are suddenly thrust into this international incident, trying to make sure that this kind of, you know, this war doesn't break out between MGM and the Chinese authorities. And nonetheless, the movie did come out, you know, but critics were very quick to point out that a North Korean invasion of the US didn't make a lot of sense. And the movie didn't kind of came and went. But again, it was kind of interesting because in 2012, the Chinese market was still relatively small. And so while people thought it was weird and probably drastic and extreme, it really wasn't cited as an example of Hollywood bending to China or the Communist Party until 2018 and 2019, when Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo brought it up in criticism of how Hollywood had fueled China's rise.
It took them to bring this up in public?
Yeah, at the time, the only example I could find of a group criticizing the change was a group of Michigan militia members who said that they thought it was a cop-out.
Wow. So talking about hidden effects, I wish that company was here for this Zoom interview for me, but there's kind of more subtle hidden effects that you talk about in your book, like product placement, which I thought was fascinating. That American companies, not even being forced to, I guess, but just in order to placate and ensure that their movies make it, are one of the 34 that are let in. So tell us about that. What kind of product placement have you noticed that's like just funny and wild?
Oh, well, once you start to notice it, you'll see it everywhere. Because what happened was, examples like Red Dawn were teaching Hollywood what to avoid. But then there was also this logic that followed that was like, well, wait, how can we goose the sales? Like, what can we do to appeal to Chinese audiences? And so this is when you started to see Chinese actresses get these smaller roles in Hollywood movies. And I mean, it was really a bait and switch where they would cast a famous Chinese actress in one scene, not give her much to do, and then make it look like she was a big part of the movie when it was released in China. And the Chinese audiences are far savvier than I think Hollywood often gives them credit. And they started calling them flower vases because they said they were just clearly hired to stand there. So that fell out of fashion relatively fast. But then the product placement ended up working for two reasons. One of which is, I think Hollywood studios thought that it would be a way to appeal to audiences there, and audiences might feel warmer toward a film if they saw products they knew. But they also were able to cash out and make some real money from these deals too, because the Chinese companies wanted to be in these Hollywood movies. But it got really silly really fast because, like, for example, there's this example in the book of one of these Transformer movies that kind of just, they stuffed as many Chinese elements into this movie as possible. And one of the like strategies was this product placement. And so there are these scenes where Mark Wahlberg is in Chicago using Chinese protein powder. And there's another scene where they have to go to an ATM in the middle of Texas, and it's a Chinese ATM. And so it's just ridiculous. And audiences in China would laugh when they saw it because it was so illogical. Now, more frequently, I think like what some people might notice is like Chinese tech is more often now the product placement of choice. So you might see, I think in the new Venom movie, I was told that I think Venom uses a Chinese cell phone. And there's oftentimes like if characters are using a messaging app, sometimes it'll be a Chinese app. And most American audiences probably aren't going to clock it, but Chinese audiences will.
So are these the actresses that they cast and actors, are they flown here for casting calls? Or like how are they actually big actors in China that they want to have visibility here?
Yeah, I think there was for a time the hope of some kind of crossover appeal. Because yeah, these are actors and actresses who have enormous careers in China. And around 2014, 2015, when it became clear that you could really make some money at the Chinese box office, producers would read scripts and be like, can this girl be Chinese? You know, would it make sense? Would it make sense if she's Chinese? I mean, they ran into issues because it actually turned out to be a lot of casting agents I would talk to said that it got very hard to find Chinese actors and actresses who could come here for long enough and also who spoke English well enough to really have significant roles. So that's why you would see these parts that were just like really just like blink and you miss them. I mean, there was this one example that was just frankly like cruel where there was a Chinese actress in an X-Men movie and she had one line and the line was "Time's up."
That's great. One interesting takeaway from your book that I hadn't realized was how much, like, at a certain point, China sends in their own film people to America to learn Hollywood techniques and like how Hollywood does it in the hopes of jumpstarting its own film industry and why it did that. So you said that at a certain point, the new leadership of China realized the power of Hollywood. What was the factor that made them realize that, do you think?
I think it was the idea, especially as China started to exert more and more of a presence overseas. I think they saw just how much Hollywood had helped America do the same. You know, in the words of one political scientist, Hollywood and other forms of soft power helped America become an empire by invitation. I'm sure you may have even seen this growing up, that Hollywood did quite a good job of advertising America to the world. And that China, you know, whenever it was moving into these countries, oftentimes introducing itself to people in, let's say, Africa or other parts of Asia, that there might need to be something that helps introduce it to those leaders and those people. So you're right, there was an effort to learn from Hollywood. And there's another saying in Chinese that dates back to the Opium Wars that says, use the West for its tools, but keep China as the essence. And that's exactly what we saw happen with the Chinese entertainment industry, where they tried to learn from Hollywood how to make their movies more sophisticated, but then they kind of molded that to fit the Chinese system, which is that art will still in some form or another serve the state. And so in some cases, they literally will hire Hollywood directors to come over and shoot movies there. Oftentimes they aren't exactly able to hire like the Spike Lees of the world, but you know, if there's a director who's down on his luck, he or she might get a call to go to Beijing for a gig. I spent some time.
I love that part of your book because I also the actors that are hired in China who are like prototypical American actors. One of the directors, I think, is Rennie Harlin, right?
Yes, Rennie Harlin, yep, who was very big in the 80s and 90s here, yep. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is, our former governor is still quite famous and popular there. Not uncommon to see his face on the posters of Chinese movies you've never heard of. I think in a lot of ways, it's become the new direct-to-video option. You know how, an actor who still has some name ID but isn't being cast in the big movies might show up on those movies that are on late at night or available for sale at the grocery store. Now, a lot of them can go to China and do similar work. I remember when I was in Shanghai in the summer of 2019, going to a party for a Russia-Chinese co-production that had just been announced, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. So really, out of sight of most Americans, people like that are flying to China, often working for a day or two, getting $1 million a day, and then flying home.
That's amazing that it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Do you think they're going to pay a penalty for that as time goes on with this all ratcheting up and as this becomes, the censorship stuff becomes public?
It might become a tougher call, but so far these movies are so out of sight, out of mind to most Western audiences that I don't think many people even know. It's also like when it was considered déclassé for big actors to do TV commercials. They would go to Europe or something and shoot commercials there because no one in the States would see them. It's a very similar mentality.
So one thing that I thought was kind of alarming. So it's not just geopolitical stuff or stuff that reflects badly on the Chinese state. China uses its power to also kind of impose its values on American movies that are shown there, and sometimes that affects things like depictions of homosexuality, right, or other moral things. So, what kind of things does the Chinese censor object to that are like that, and how is that?
I think homosexuality is a good example where movies that are released in one form in the US often have to see certain things removed before they can screen for Chinese audiences. I mean, one prominent example was the movie about Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody, which already in the US was criticized for whitewashing and sanitizing Freddie Mercury's homosexuality. But in China, he was all but a ladies' man. I mean, in the Chinese version, they don't really acknowledge his gay relationships. There were even reports that in some theaters, in the scene when Freddie Mercury announces that he has AIDS, the sound just dropped out and no one in the audience knew what he was saying in that moment. So that's one example, I think, of there just being this kind of, as you said, sort of not necessarily a political stance, but more like almost like a cultural stance that they want to exercise, and that is controlling what their people see. So then you can imagine what Chinese movies are allowed to explore. And so when Chinese movies are produced and then exported around the world, they, like American movies before them, are reflecting a certain set of values.
Yeah, I would love to see the Chinese version of Brokeback Mountain. That would
I think it'd be a very a film about a great friendship.
So how are they doing with this exporting of their culture through film? Like, I thought it was interesting that you talked about, in certain technical ways, they're actually kind of remarkable. Like, you talked about the studios that are in different eras. Could you tell everyone about that? Like, in different decades or...
Right. I mean, some of the scenes that I would walk into were just absolutely surreal, because China, whenever it decided that a domestic film industry was going to be a priority, I mean, these developments just sprung up out of nowhere. If you are a Chinese real estate developer, it is very easy to know what to invest in, because the government will often say, this is a priority, go do it. And so these movie sets would appear out of nowhere. And what was fascinating is they would be like these little sort of cityscapes. And if you walked through them, it was almost like a backlot here at Warner Brothers or at Paramount. But instead of walking down a New York City street, you might walk by a village that replicates a 12th century dynasty. And then you keep walking, and then you're in the 14th century, and then you're in the 16th century. And to Chinese eyes, that audiences can tell the difference between when a movie is set based on the aesthetic of certain dynasties. So these massive, gargantuan villages of sets would sprout up out of nowhere, where you could essentially, if you were filming the 12th century one day, you could go over here. If you were filming the 14th century the other day, you could go over here. And what was fascinating was the towns themselves would almost become it felt a little Disney-fied. Like, I spent some time in these towns that were essentially built for movie making. And you would drive in and you would see a sign saying, like, welcome to Huaro, China, famous movie town. And then there'd be statues of Charlie Chaplin on the street and Marilyn Monroe, and the cigarette ashtrays would be in the shape of film reels. And you would stub your cigarettes out in the middle of the film reel. I mean, it was like everything was just aesthetically embracing this industry that had sort of justified its creation.
So it's like a whole, like Hollywood Boulevard writ large.
Exactly, but in the middle of like a farming community, just like out of nowhere springing up. I did go to this one set. It was called Hot Sexy Plaza, and it was a set that was built for Chinese movies that want to take place in New York. And so it was all these sort of fake facades of a New York City. But what was so fascinating, and you'll appreciate this as a former New Yorker, it was clearly like pre-Giuliani New York. Like, all it was strip clubs and like smut theaters. Exactly. Yeah. So I was like, well, this is a very specific portrayal of New York.
So is there a homegrown film industry? Do they have the same worship of celebrity? Like, what are their stars like, and how are they chosen? Is there, I guess, there's a studio system where the party chooses the stars?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I think over the past 10 or 15 years, there's definitely been a celebrity class that's taken shape. And that's going to be obviously at odds with a communist system, right? Like, how does a celebrity work in a communist regime? And what a lot of the most skilled of the actors and actresses can do is balance commercial pursuits with political work. So what you'll often find is that the people who have really risen to the top of the A-list in China are able to kind of constantly make sure that their political currency is in check. So there can be like a one for you, one for me model, where they might go make a big science fiction movie or a big family comedy, but then they come back and they star in a propaganda movie that's made by the Chinese authorities. And that allows them to accrue some political capital that they go spend by making a more commercial movie. Interestingly enough, the person who has really handled this deftly is Jackie Chan. I think a lot of Americans remember him because of his fame here in the US, but in China, he's really known as, in some ways, an agent of the state, because he stars in so many movies that are government priorities.
Except that there's someone like Chloe Zhao, right, who also was a favorite daughter of the Chinese film industry who ran afoul of it. How did that happen?
Right, she's the daughter of a Chinese industrialist who was largely educated in the West, and then after graduating from NYU Film School, actually, she started working in independent film, and then last year made Nomadland, which very early in the Oscar race was the favorite to win Best Director and Best Picture. And at first, Chinese state media was very quick to embrace her. They called her the pride of China. And this was actually seen as a potential soft power victory for China, because all around the world, they were expecting photos of a Chinese-born director accepting Hollywood's top prize. But then, somewhere along the way, comments that she had made a decade earlier to an obscure entertainment magazine were unearthed. And they were comments where she had said that growing up in China was growing up in a place where there were lies everywhere. And these comments spread through Chinese social media, which is often a place for really nationalist sentiment. Sometimes it's amplified by the government, and sometimes it's just there are these like there's quite a robust nationalist movement in China that targets these kind of remarks. And Chloe Zhao essentially disappeared from the Chinese internet. And if you were using the Chinese internet, you would have never known that she won the Oscar. You would have never known that her movie came out. Her next movie was a big Marvel movie that did not get released in China. And it essentially seems as though these comments she had made a decade earlier are going to cost her any visibility in her home country. So it's really, I mean, it's really a drastic case study in how someone can leave China, but then still find themselves having to play by its rules.
And at least she just gets figuratively disappeared. You talk about people who actually do disappear in China, just never seen again, who are celebrities there. What kind of infractions you have to commit to be sidelined there?
Yeah, the most prominent example is a Chinese actress who is named Fan Bingbing, who disappeared for several weeks when she was busted for tax evasion. She was reporting one salary to the authorities and actually pocketing a much bigger one. And she disappeared for several weeks. It actually feels in many ways like a prequel to what happened to Peng Shuai, the tennis star, more recently. And I also think that it was another example of Hollywood getting kind of caught in the middle, because at the time of her disappearance, Fan Bingbing was supposed to be in Europe filming a movie with Jessica Chastain and Penelope Cruz called The 355. It came out a couple weeks ago. I think me and like 14 other people saw it. But it was this big international spectacle about these like female spies that Fan Bingbing was supposed to be in. And then obviously she couldn't show up to set because no one knew where she was. She was somewhere in government custody. So eventually she reemerged. And when she reemerged, she, I mean, per our earlier point, started making some propaganda movies and reaccruing that political capital that she had lost. Now, what was fascinating, though, is she still was expected to be in this movie that Universal was making with Jessica Chastain. So they had to fly her to Los Angeles and film her scenes in front of a green screen that were then inserted into the film. So I went to see this movie when it came out because I reported this in the book, having not seen the movie. So I wanted to see just how obvious it was. It is very obvious that she has been green screened into that movie. And not only that, but when you know she couldn't be on set, it's very obvious when a body double is being used because there are so many scenes of her shot from the back. It's like all we see is the back of her head.
So I know we want to get to questions soon. We talk about China importing its culture to. You talked about Africa, that it's very successfully done so in Africa. To what extent is that also true in other Asian countries or in Europe or Australia? Have they had similar success anywhere else?
Not as much. And the reason I wanted to focus a little bit on China's inroads in Africa is because in the US, sometimes I think we can get a little myopic. And I often will hear from people who say, well, a Chinese blockbuster is never going to play in America. So these ambitions are, short-sighted. And I think it sort of neglects to remember that there's a big wide world out there, and there are a lot of other audiences that Chinese entertainment could reach. And in Africa specifically, where there's been a lot of investment through its Belt and Road program in infrastructure, and a lot of these, there's been quite a bit of ink spilled on all of the investment that China is making into the continent. I went there because I was fascinated by what it was doing to try and win people over culturally. And the main system that the government is using is this initiative called the 10,000 Villages Project, which distributes low-cost satellite dishes to African villages that carry Chinese movies and TV shows on them. So I went to Nairobi and then drove about 2.5 hours outside Nairobi, so really inner Kenya, and would walk into apartments in the middle of the day and see families watching Chinese soap operas. One night I went back and hung out with a family and ate dinner, and we watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And it wasn't necessarily like a wholesale replacement of American entertainment, but there certainly was a coexistence. You know, I met a young boy who was 4 or 5 years old, and he told me that his hero was the Monkey King, but his other hero was The Rock. So it was like sort of existing side by side. But but remember that this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening as China is also trying to, in the eyes of Kenyan leaders, become the superpower benefactor, right? Replacing the US. As the US becomes more isolationist, China is trying to sort of step in and fill that power vacuum. And when I was there, I had a meeting with a Kenyan official in Nairobi the day that Donald Trump was being impeached for the first time. This was in January of 2020. And he had CNN on in his office while we were meeting. And he looked to me, the American reporter, and said, you know, does this really look like the cleanest system? Like, if you were in my shoes, is this the system that you would try to implement? Look at how you treat your leaders. And you started to see how this broader debate between democracy and whatever you want to call China's model, authoritarian capitalism or what have you, was really quite grounded in his office. It was a very pragmatic decision he was making day to day.
It's also interesting that, you know, despite all the money and efforts China's making, that in other Asian countries, South Korea has been so much more successful at least in America. I don't know how, but I think probably globally as well, like with Squid Game and places like that. Does that drive Chinese crazy to see their Asian neighbor like eat their lunch like that?
Well, I think South Korea right now certainly is accomplishing what China would love to have. China, I mean, the Squid Game and going back to Parasite winning Best Picture at the Oscars, and even the popularity of K-pop, I think,
especially.
Exactly. It's just the kind of sort of cultural exporting that China is trying to do. But the key difference, and I think some would say the Achilles heel, is that Chinese authorities would never allow the production of a Squid Game.
Why is that?
Violence aside, it's a 10-episode, commentary on class. I mean, there's just way too many themes and areas that the authorities would be absolutely forbidding filmmakers from touching. So really the question becomes, like, does the safety of China's programming put a ceiling on its appeal? And that's why I think in places like Africa, where China is trying to make cultural inroads vis-a-vis the US, we're seeing them have to subsidize it and have to try and say, well, if we give you the satellite dish at a lower cost, will you watch our stuff? That is sort of how the game is being played right now, is sort of paying to close or shorten that gap in influence or appeal.
It's kind of funny because I thought if capitalism is the undoing of the American film industry, their desire to make as much money as possible, it's going to be communism and that kind of totalitarianism that's going to be the undoing or hindrance on the Chinese film industry because of the things that you said, like things that they can't show or refusal to tackle stuff that their audience wants. So,
No, absolutely.
I
guess this is time for questions, right?
Yes. So it looks like our first question that has the most votes is from Josh R. He asks, Erich, have you heard anything about China's reaction to the book in your reporting?
No. I mean, the short answer is no. I haven't heard too much from folks in China. I will say, I mean, I think one thing that I always keep in mind is that while a lot of times these conversations focus on China's ambitions and Chinese censorship of Hollywood, there is also quite a bit of pride in China and in Chinese entertainment circles for what the country has managed to pull off, how quickly it has built this entertainment industry. And so I think sometimes, like, while these conversations can focus on things that make China seem nefarious or in some way kind of controlling or authoritarian over Hollywood, there is also quite a bit of pride there for the power, economic and political, they've been able to accrue in a short amount of time. So I think there is a world where parts of the Chinese government think it's great that I've written a book about how powerful they are.
All right. And Nick Haggard asks, are you aware of any efforts by the US government to counteract, buffer, or otherwise lessen China's influence on Hollywood? Is there little that can be done given that we're a free market driven liberal democracy as opposed to an authoritarian state?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was something that I learned when I was educating myself on the history of Hollywood, was just that how much this is really, these past 20 years have been the exception. When Hollywood was first forming, it was known as they called it an adjunct of the State Department. And the officials in DC who would lobby on behalf of the studios would say, like, we are going to sell America to the world with American movies. And then during World War II, directors were literally conscripted into the war effort and told to go and film battle scenes and told to tell stories like Mrs. Miniver and Sergeant York that would bolster support for the war effort at home. And then in the Cold War, we had the same thing. There was a reason we had so many Soviet villains. It was because there was this sense that that Hollywood was going to help America along if it could. That has changed, though, very recently. I've been told stories of how after 9/11, there were these thoughts that maybe we should try and figure out a way to have Hollywood help sell our efforts in the Middle East. It never really quite worked because starting in the early 2000s, these studios became global companies. And, I was talking to one executive who worked at Sony, which releases the Spider-Man movies. And he told me once, when he started, the first Spider-Man movie that was released under his watch had an American flag on the poster. And then a couple iterations later, it had no flag. Not because it didn't want to, be down on America, but just because these are now global products that are seen in movie theaters around the world and don't want to alienate any audiences. So I think a lot of studio executives, if they were, if Joe Biden called them up and said, I really want you to do something to help my agenda here, and I want you to help, do what Hollywood's always done and sell America to the rest of the world, I think a lot of executives would say, like, that's just not my remit. I'm making movies that are making more money overseas than in the US these days. I can't sort of have that focus.
Kind of following up with that and Maer's earlier point about the reach of countries like South Korea, do you think, what does the future look like? Does China have the reach to have more cultural supremacy?
I think so. I mean, we're talking about a scale here that is almost unfathomable. It's not uncommon for Chinese movies that most Americans have never heard of to be released in China and make $800 million there. They often don't travel. They often don't export. That's still the case. But right now, we've seen a Hollywood that is growing, frankly, getting a little smaller in some ways with its focus on streaming, while China seems to still be trying to develop this massive theatrical market. So I don't necessarily, like I said, I don't necessarily think we're looking at a world where there's a wholesale replacement, but it does seem like there will be more of a coexistence. And like I said, it's very clear that China's willing to fund that effort if it has to.
Well, now that China's receiving so much more attention, and given their encroachment on like things that Americans see and American values, is there anything the government or Congress or anyone can do to turn this around?
I think the political pressure is rising. I mean, the Olympics is a perfect example, where we have these winter games, and it seems like NBC and others have made the calculation that they cannot report on these games and not mention the human rights abuses and the free expression issues and leave Beijing with their reputations intact. It feels like the criticism is just growing so loud that it seems like DC will probably be paying more attention to this. I'm not sure if consumers will. So far, every time there's something like a John Cena hostage video, there's a brief flare up, and I think the studios or the actor himself has 1 or 2 days of bad PR, but then memories fade and the access to China remains. So that's really been the dynamic, not just in Hollywood, but for companies in a lot of different sectors, that maintaining that long-term access is still worth it. Now, I guess the big question becomes, does China still allow that access? We're seeing in every sector, from Hollywood to fashion to cars, China trying to turn inward and really focus on supporting its own industries. And so that creates a whole new set of obstacles, because what happens if China decides it doesn't want to do business with the West anymore? There's a sense in Hollywood now that after 15 years of running toward Chinese revenue, China's starting to put the wall back up. And in a lot of corners of Hollywood, there's a sense that they just got completely played.
So I know we're coming up on the hour here. Are you guys good to stay for maybe 2 more questions?
Sure. Mayor, do you have anywhere to be?
Not tonight. I'll come over to your place, actually.
You should.
So Trip Mickle asks, how much do you think Universal films are in the backs of the minds of NBC as it broadcasts and commentates on the Olympics, which you mentioned? And would 1980s Hollywood make Eileen Gu a villain?
Oh, fascinating question. So I think, by way of explanation, so NBC, which is broadcasting the Olympics, is part of NBC Universal, which also owns the Universal Movie Studio, owns Peacock, the streaming service, and is also then nested within Comcast, the giant cable company. So lots of tentacles there, lots of potential tripwires to screw up a lot of business in China. I'm not necessarily sure when NBC is leading Olympics coverage how much the Universal movies might be in mind, but I do think that there are other investments that have proven even more consequential. Universal, this isn't very well known, but Universal just recently finished construction on a theme park outside Beijing that it will be opening quite soon, and that will give Universal a presence almost on par with Disney in China. So I think those kinds of efforts are probably more top of mind. Now it's an interesting question about the idea of a Chinese villain in a 1980s movie, because let's be clear, Hollywood has not always gotten it right with the portrayal of certain ethnicities and certain nationalities. I think what's fascinating about the scrubbing of Chinese villains from Hollywood films is that it's also really meant a kind of flattening of the portrayal of China at all. There hasn't really been much of an exploration of life in China or of Chinese history. I mean, let's put villains aside. It's really been I think China remains rather opaque to most Americans, because this economic leverage has really put a stranglehold on what Hollywood can explore creatively.
Eric, do you think there's room in independent films and documentaries to counteract that?
Yes, absolutely. I think right now, anytime you see a movie or a TV show that is exploring China in a more unvarnished light, chances are it is an independent film or a documentary. And what's fascinating is actually Netflix has become an unlikely source of, at least I'd say, some stories. I'm not saying it's like there's like a bevy of them, but some stories that are critical of China, because Netflix tried several years ago to get into the country, but Chinese leaders put up a bunch of protectionist measures designed to preserve their own streaming industry. Alibaba and other Chinese firms have these robust streaming services that they wanted to be able to compete without Netflix coming in. So the number of countries that Netflix doesn't operate in is very small, and it includes China, Syria, and North Korea. And so when Netflix leaders realized that they were not going to get into China and they should stop trying, it gave them more license to host documentaries and produce movies that could explore China in different ways. But they really are among the only ones. I mean, and I think, a friend of mine has a book coming out about Apple's recent history, and that is a fascinating case where Apple here, this giant tech company that's moving into entertainment, they're not going to touch anything about China either. I mean, they've got not only 1.4 billion consumers over there, but they've also got a supply chain that could be severely disrupted by angering China. So I don't necessarily think that the tech revolution of Hollywood is going to, bring us to a new chapter in this relationship or this dynamic either.
So it's all up to Netflix, I guess.
I mean, I don't know. Wouldn't they love to hear that? I don't know. I think
like if they're
a
gone,
wrinkle in it, I'd say.
how do you distribute documentaries if they're no longer there? If they get co-opted, or if they, there are no, even if you have documentaries that are being made, if there's no distribution system that's widespread, you're kind of in the same position. Right,
exactly. And also, I think what's the risk assessment of people who might finance those kind of projects too? Is that really where you want to put your money if you're worried about there being noise or consequences elsewhere?
Speaking of documentaries, Nick Haggard also just asked, is there a red carpet doc in the works?
Oh gosh, thank you. I hope so. This is great promo. I'm hoping that there will be. There's nothing finalized yet, but there is some interest, and I am dying for it to happen because there were so many times when I was reporting this book, whether it was in Kenya or in these giant sound stages in China, where I wished that I could just actually show people what I was seeing rather than have to describe it in words, which is much harder. There were so many times where I'd like to do that, and there were so many rich characters, some of whom I was able to include in the book, some of whom didn't make the final cut, that I would love to sort of reach audiences with. So yeah, I'm hoping that is in the works at some point.
I'd love to hear about that American character actor who plays all the weird American roles as payback for all the Chinese stereotype roles.
Oh yeah, my buddy, there's a buddy of mine, Michael, who moved to China as a businessman and then was discovered in a Beijing community theater performance of The Odd Couple, and then started moonlighting as an actor portraying Winston Churchill in Chinese propaganda movies. He was loving life. And I've seen it. He did tell me though that sometimes he would show up to set and realize that the director wasn't even expecting a British accent.
All right, guys. This will be our last question from Eileen McOntier. They ask, in the US, companies and industry groups have long used PR and government affairs to influence legislation, as well as in the case of product placement to get favorable attention in movies. I think the Pentagon's a famous example of that. So has China simply learned and adopted these Western techniques for its propaganda efforts?
I think it's a great point. The short answer is yes, that there has been sort of a transposing of the American model onto the Chinese one. But I'd say what you're describing, the dynamic you're describing of the Pentagon or the US military using films like Top Gun to sort of give them a sheen or a sex appeal, that is more systematized in China. I mean, there is a ministry called the Ministry of Propaganda that produces movies itself and will write scripts, put them into production. And so, whereas in Hollywood, it might be seen as more of a partnership, in China, there's more of a just sort of linear system that sort of puts them right into the pipeline. And then when they come out in theaters, usually timed to certain holidays or anniversaries. So every time it's the anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, you're going to have new movies about the glories of the People's Liberation Army. They also then have a system in place that allows them to kind of guarantee those movies do well. So sometimes if you run a state-backed company, you might get a phone call saying, hey, Mayor, like, wouldn't it be great if you took all your employees to the movies this Friday? Oh, and also, wouldn't it be great if you went to see this one? So I think that there is a transposing of that more recently, because what's happening is as I say in the book, the Chinese studios are learning how to put the pill in the peanut butter, and they're learning that the most effective propaganda doesn't ever feel like propaganda. And so if you can make a movie that's commercial and entertaining while also extolling the glories of China and China's history, that's all the better, because it won't go down like medicine.
That's the art, right? Like, you could have all the tech and the know-how, but that's going to be the secret sauce, and really it'll determine the success of the industry, I'd imagine.
Exactly, and that's the looming question. So that's what has to be explored in my sequel.
All right, and on that note, that's a wrap on our presentation. I'm sure we could go on for another hour. It's such a fascinating subject. Thank you again to our guests, Erich and Maer, and to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and support of independent bookstores. Again, please click the green button below to purchase a copy of this terrific book, Red Carpet by Erich Schwartzel. We also accept donations on our site. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you guys once again.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Book Soup. I love both of you. Thank you so much.
Good night.